Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
This is the First Amendment that protects your right to stand here, protects mine.
The freedom of speech, widely considered the cornerstone of modern democracy, has also become increasingly weaponized.
But opinions shouldn't be illegal.
Not just in its use,
bring back free speech to America,
but also how we personally define it.
We don't ban offensive speech.
How we perceive others' definition of it.
And across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
And how we police it when it goes too far.
But we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time.
The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the freedom of speech, but that protection is not absolute.
But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
And despite recent condemnation from American leadership on how other countries choose to limit it, the United States also struggles within itself to find consensus on when the freedom of expression goes too far. Should the freedom of speech be absolute or strategically censored? And what kind of problems does this ambiguity create for yourself and for your country, American or not? Well, let's take a look. In general, the freedom of speech is the right to articulate opinions and ideas without interference, retaliation, or punishment from the government. In most Western democracies, the term speech is interpreted broadly and includes spoken and written words as well as symbolic speech. So, for example, what a person wears, reads, performs, and protests. Freedom of speech is a right preserved in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and is formally granted by the laws of most nations. But in the United States, the freedom of speech is a bit unique in that it also protects speech whose ideas put forth are illogical, offensive, immoral, or hateful. From a global perspective, this places the United States at the far end of the freedom of speech spectrum, with the other end occupied by authoritarian nations such as China, North Korea, Myanmar, and Russia, where speaking out against the government can land you with jail time. But what happens here in the middle? This is quite a complicated assessment, but the Global Expression Report, published annually by Article 19, does provide a good data-driven analysis on the freedom of expression globally. As you can see from this graphic, the majority of European countries are quite close to the United States in providing broad protection of general freedom of expression. In fact, many surpass it by their measurement, including Germany, which I imagine would come at a surprise to Mr. Musk and Mr. Vance. But it is worth noting that this particular metric, which, by the way, assesses 161 countries, giving them a score between 0 and 100 based off of 25 indicators, is not solely a measurement of what I can or cannot say. Rather, it builds a quantifiable perspective on expression, from posting online to protesting, investigating, and accessing the information needed to keep leaders accountable. The latter likely hindering the US assessment. That being said, leaning more towards the restrictive end of the spectrum would be countries like Thailand. For example, in April 2021, a Thai man from the Chiang Rai province in Thailand was arrested and received a 28-year sentence for violating a law which prohibited criticizing the country's monarchy. The truth of the matter is, the freedom of expression is broad, and the tools that you have to exercise it vary widely from one country to the next. But it's also important to emphasize that the freedom of expression is a multifaceted human right, and there isn't concrete consensus on it. For example, purists who vigorously defend the First Amendment and advocate for the unlimited exercise of free speech believe that speech, unlike physical conduct or force, should be countered with other speech. The general idea is that speech in and of itself is not violent, and challenging ideas promotes critical thinking and growth. In theory, but in practice, things become much more sticky. And prominent leaders on both the right and the left engage in censorship in the United States. Instead of using speech or protest to counter the speech or expression that they criticize or dislike, people on both sides of the aisle appear to want to prevent ideas they don't like from entering the conversation. Take what happened recently at Stanford University as a prime example. When a Trump-appointed federal judge, U.S. Circuit Court Judge Stuart Kyle Duncan, gave a speech at the university, student protesters interrupted him and disrupted the speech he had been invited by other students to give. But things escalated from there. Instead of telling the students that they were in violation of Stanford's speech policy, the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who attended the event, appeared to sympathize with the students. Then, Stanford's law school's dean, Jenny Martinez, issued an apology to the judge and explained to the public that Stanford's speech policies do not permit coordinated efforts to shut down invited speakers. And then things escalated again. Students then protested the dean's apology, claiming that counter speech is free speech. But coordinated efforts to shut down someone's speech through disruption or threat of violence, sometimes called the Heckler's veto, is actually not protected free speech. This was one of those situations where the students wanted to counter speech with speech, but ended up violating free speech. But before my viewers on the right decry this as an example of the woke mob, we need to balance this criticism a little bit. Historically, it is the left, on principle, who has been a major champion of protecting free speech, including offensive and hateful speech. This most famously includes the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, who in 1977 defended the right of these guys to march in a town whose residents included many Holocaust survivors, and their defense was led by a Jewish American lawyer. Furthermore, the infringement of free speech is something that the right regularly engages with as well.
Free speech.
Maybe we should boycott Starbucks. I don't know.
Free speech.
We ought to boycott Geico.
Free speech.
Get that son of off the field. Freedom of speech.
For all of the upheaval and anger about cancel culture, conservatives too have embraced an extreme version of censorship in order to resist a rapidly changing society, with laws that would ban books, stifle teachers, and discourage open discussions in classrooms. And even just last week, the Trump administration banned the Associated Press from covering White House events. The AP is the United States' most omnipresent media source. They span out across the country, and their pieces fill your local newspapers and major news media outlets. By law, when the government makes a decision, it can't be arbitrary. They must have a compelling reason to restrict the First Amendment on the rights of free speech and the freedom of the press. And a squabble over how the AP labels the Gulf of America / Gulf of Mexico, which precipitated all of this, according to the Trump-appointed judge who's overseeing the court case on this move, is pretty clearly viewpoint discrimination and a violation of free speech by the White House. Today's video is made possible by my supporters on Patreon. If you would like to gain early access to videos before they're uploaded to YouTube, as well as participate in exclusive Q&A sessions with me, please consider subscribing to my channel at patreon.com/typeashton. Now, all of that being said, I think a big problem with the freedom of speech in the United States is that it is widely misinterpreted and often weaponized as a way of virtue signaling. And I see this all the time in the comment section of my videos. Not all, but quite a few many of my American viewers are convinced that they and they alone have the righteous interpretation on the freedom of speech, and that those living in Europe specifically are being silenced. However, in the United States, the freedom of speech does not mean that you can say whatever you want when you want. Both public and private institutions have the legal right to restrict your speech, both in person and online. Take public universities as a prime example. Despite being public and receiving funding from the federal government, they still may legally restrict speech that falsely defames a specific individual, constitutes a genuine threat or harassment, is intended and likely to provoke imminent unlawful action, or otherwise violates the law. In addition, universities may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of speech in order to ensure that it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. In short, universities are not censoring you by expecting the bare minimum of civility. Hate speech, harassment, and insults are not the same thing as criticism and do not contribute to critical discourse. And that is the exact same distinction that countries like Germany enshrine in their laws. It's a central pillar of their society, and therefore it applies to everyone in society. You gotta be civil with one another. Your voice matters. You have the right to say what you think, share information, and demand a better world. You also have the right to agree or disagree with those in power and to express these opinions in peaceful protests. What you don't have the right to do is to be about it. But you see, that might actually get me in trouble. I'm only kind of joking here. Back in 2021, a German Twitter user was awoken by 6 police officers at 6 a.m. demanding access to his home. They were there to gather evidence for a criminal investigation. What potential crime prompted this? Well, he called the Interior and Sports Minister for the city of Hamburg a male genitalia part. But this is hardly the first time that Germany's strict laws against speech crimes, including crimes based on incitement and defamation and hatred, have hit the headlines. In June 2020, the German police union filed a criminal complaint against the newspaper Tageszeitung, claiming that it had incited hatred by publishing a column comparing the police to, quote, trash, end quote, that should be thrown in the landfill, end quote. And somewhat similar laws limiting speech with similar salacious headlines can be found in other European countries as well. In 2021, for example, a French court fined an activist 10,000 euros for depicting President Emmanuel Macron as a certain Austrian art school reject on billboards protesting the country's pandemic policies. And in 2020, Europol, the European Union's law enforcement agency, had a coordinated clampdown on online hate speech in Germany, Italy, France, Greece, Norway, Britain, and the Czech Republic. You know, I really do think you could probably make the argument that in the United States, the freedom of speech is one of the few truly libertarian impulses that we have in the US Constitution. And so many Americans view European laws on restricting speech as a form of state-sponsored censorship. There are numerous examples of speech, body language, or imagery that would violate the laws that many European countries uphold. But at the same time, in my opinion, prohibiting wrongful conduct is perfectly consistent with a right to liberty. And by wrongful, I mean conduct that violates the rights of others. Some people will interpret this as your freedom ends where mine begins, but I think at a much simpler level, it is that no one has the right to do wrong to another person. And again, disclaimer, this is my personal opinion on this, but I find that a huge missing piece of this discussion on the freedom of speech, especially when we're talking about it from a European versus American perspective, is that we spend the majority of the time talking about the limitations and the rights of the people who are exercising free speech, and not nearly enough on the rights of the people who are affected by it. The sad reality is that we live in a different world now from when the First Amendment was drafted. The tyranny, harassment, and oppression of today does not necessarily come from a king, but from the unfettered speech and misinformation propagated amongst the masses. Americans especially are at a real civil reckoning with what to do when you live in a largely unregulated digital society that also has a propensity for violence. Online hate can sometimes find a way to come into real life and hurt people. And we see this most dramatically and tragically with the most vulnerable, minorities, and young people in our society, who equally deserve our protection. So while I think it is entirely honorable and desirable to try to protect the rights of all citizens without trampling on the rights that we see as the foundation for our democracy, it is also difficult, if not impossible, to achieve entirely in practice. And believe me, I agree wholeheartedly that this is an incredibly difficult thing to manage and legislate. Where exactly that line lies between expressing an opinion or a critique versus a violation of hate speech is not clear. And it is important that we constantly evaluate it. And I also think that it is equally as important that we spend just as much time teaching people how to engage in civil, critical discourse. Speaking as somebody who grew up in the United States, I never received any formal education on how to have a critical civil debate on touchy subjects like religion or politics or ethics. It was just simply not part of my K-12 education because probably the school system didn't want to be sued. And debate club as an extracurricular activity was not something that I had access to. That was usually something that was only reserved for the wealthy school districts. And you can read into that what you will. But I think the lack of training and tools on how to be critical without insulting someone is evident in the carte blanche that we give freedom of speech in the United States. Many will say it is too difficult, too complex, and rather than debate and mediate in order to find a common ground that does the most good with the least amount of harm, we simply say all or nothing. But I personally disagree. It is precisely that those things which are important and good are difficult. I don't think Europeans always get it right, but I also don't think Americans do either. The freedom of expression and the problems which surround it is something that we both share, and one of the most pressing issues of modern society.
You have to be polite and civil. When people are talking, then other people are talking, and then you get a chance to talk. Set up your own rally. A lot of people worked hard for this. Come on, man.
But I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section of this video. I am certain that this specific topic is going to bring out some very passionate debaters, but as long as we can keep things civil and critical without being insulting or harassing, I certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts. So again, please let me know those down below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Cheers!